Good morning to you. I'm Matt Berryman. I'm the new executive director at Episcopal Charities here in your Diocese of Northern Illinois. I'm here to do a bit of sharing with you today about Episcopal Charities, but more than that, and I think most importantly, about who God is for us. I know that's the reason we're here today. And I want to thank Kevin for having me here, and for Julie and Beth, who are or were trustees at our organization, who are fellow parishioners of yours, who did some work to pave the way for me to be here and to celebrate worshiping God with you on this day. Well, you're aware that we're well on the other side of Easter now. It's been a few weeks. And in fact, this past Thursday, the church celebrated the ascension of Jesus into heaven. So we're deep into Easter, and thank goodness in Chicago, I just returned from a trip to the Holy Land, and I was pleased that when I got back, it was Easter to such an extent that it had turned warm. I'm so glad. Even though yesterday when I drove out here, I drove through a hailstorm, which is just so weird. But anyway, Easter, it seems to be embedded in our very lives. And some days we have the ability to see it and others we don't. It's not only in our lives, but it's everywhere if we have the eyes to see and ears to hear. It's just this thing that's part of the breathing of the cosmos and life here as we understand it. It's a pattern, and you can see it maybe most explicitly in the cycles of the seasons. Have you ever stopped to think about that? The winter to spring to summer to fall, that there's a pattern here, and it just keeps turning, and it's this dying and rising and dying and rising. There's a hymn I grew up with called the Hymn of Promise, and the verses have always meant something. It's very simple, always meant something to me. In the bulb there is a flower, in the seed an apple tree, in cocoons a hidden promise. Butterflies will soon be free. In the cold and snow of winter, there's a spring that waits to be, unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see. In another place in John's Gospel, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." So everywhere in the gospel, in our seasons, in our lives, in our hearts, there's this thing happening, this unmistakable pattern of loss and restoration, of endings and beginnings, of decay and growth and death and life. I think it's hard for us, though, because we like things the way we like them, and we like it comfortable, and we like it easy. And this pattern, it's challenging. It asks things of us. So when we plant the seed, we've got to be ready to let go of the seed, because what we get in return isn't a seed anymore. So there's a necessary saying goodbye to that seed so that a tree can come up. And we have the luxury of knowing what happens when we bury a bulb in the ground. We get a beautiful tulip. But we've got to be ready to let the bulb go. And in the same way, after winter, gloriously comes spring. But what if you like winter? So much so that you just don't want it to go away. You like the comfort of it. You like it there's a demand to spring. There's a challenge involved in springtime. It asks for growth. So what if you just want to wrap up in your blanket and sit in front of the fire and never leave? What do? What if you like the prison chains, and even though God unfastens them, you say, I don't want to leave here. It's nice. I don't have to do much. I was raised in the church in South Carolina, in the United Methodist Church, so if you hear a little accent, you'll know, oh, he's from the South. You hear a little of that still lingering. My mom was a music and youth director, so we were in church every time the doors were opened. And I like to say, Methodists don't go out at night, but we did. We were there at the nighttime services. And I served some churches in Jacksonville, Florida, and the United Kingdom. I became a United Methodist pastor after I went to seminary. It was our life. Our family lived in Tennessee and Kentucky, so we didn't see them much. So our church was our family. And so I became a United Methodist pastor, and I started doing some consulting in the denomination and got married and had a pretty wife and a new baby. And I was a decent musician and a relatively good preacher and decent teacher, and I know that some people looked and thought I probably had promise as a leader, and I look back at all that, and isn't it interesting to look back? There's so much wisdom in looking back. I was checking the boxes. I was doing everything right. I was pleasing people. I was understandably doing all of those kinds of things. And it's like most of us in the first half of our lives, as Richard Rohr talks about in a book called Falling Upward. If you have read that, if not, you should go check it out. It's about this. The first half of our lives, when it's about our egos. It's about us. It's about me. It's about building my life and my stuff and my things and my claims, my rights. And so that's what I was doing, and that's all good. But at some point, though, spiritual health, maturity, and so on require us to grow out of that. It really does. It leads us into a more healthy place, a more spiritual place, and it really isn't possible to be in a deeper relationship with God if you can't move out of that. Well, I like a lot of us do, and some for the rest of our lives even, I didn't really. I just sort of went there kicking and screaming. Hadn't really learned what faith was either. I believed, but faith is the thing that leads us onward. Faith, I did not understand. I could talk about it as a pastor, but, there's a really long distance. Some of you know what I mean when I say this. There's such a long distance sometimes between here and here, between the head and the heart. It's a different way of knowing, isn't it? It's a different kind of knowing. And faith is about that. It's about letting go. It's about turning something over, surrendering. It's about letting go of what we hold tightly to and just giving it over and letting our lives be what God has for us instead of what we think it ought to be or want it to be. I can remember standing at the back of the church, as a pastor does, as person after person would pass me, and I remember those fragile days of my own ego, still very much in need of your approval and others' approval and everyone's, and to tell me how good I was and a good boy and what a great sermon and all that stuff. So don't tell me if it was a good sermon or not after the end of the service. And if I didn't get enough praise, because I was so tied to it, I'd call a friend after the service who was there, and I knew she would tell me how good I had done, because I thought it was about me. I didn't know. But I was doing enough good and checking the boxes, and everything looked good on the outside, so it seemed good. But when it's all about you, and it continues to be all about you, I was miserable inside, growing miserable. Because when your life's about you, you get scared, you worry. And here's the other thing about it. You think that everything's up to you, and there's no room for faith because you got to do it. It's yours, all of it. I could recite a creed, I could talk about scripture, and I was a nice guy, good, pastor of a church, but I just didn't get it, and I didn't know how to surrender. I thought that was the enemy. I didn't know how to have faith. For me, the young pastor with the shiny life and the shiny wife and the resume and all the stuff, I was miserable inside. And to cope with that sort of knock, that continued knock, that unconscious knock that was growing more loudly, I was using more than a few drinks in the evening to silence it. That invitation to change, I was not wanting to hear it, to dull the ache. Parker Palmer once said that there can be no greater suffering than living a lifelong lie. And I needed to let go and live the life God had for me. Well, when the wine stopped working and I couldn't go any longer, and the wine always, whatever your wine is, I don't know what your wine is, but whenever the wine stops working, if it's shopping or whatever you use, it always does stop working, by the way. And so when it quit working for me and I couldn't go any longer, I just fell apart. And God's grace caught me, and I surrendered and began to let go of the winter of my life. And the chains fell off. And admitting all of that's hard. Some of you know what I mean, because you don't plan on falling apart. It's not like, hey, when I grow up, I want to fall apart. But you let go. And for me, it was the first time I let go. It was scary. And I turned myself over to something else, to God. I surrendered control over things. And God was with me during the falling apart, the watchful and merciful eye of God. And God would put me back together again. In that surrender, in that falling apart, you could say that I died and that God's new creation was born. And the scriptures, what sometimes seemed opaque to me, really opened up because I started to see my life in them, my world in them, and in the seasons, winter and spring. Well, you might be sitting here having fallen apart maybe a few times. I think we have these moments in our lives where we just have to, or maybe you haven't had it yet. You've been fighting it, and we're in that question of what am I doing? What is all this about anyway? Why is that ache so present right now? When the ink on the divorce decree dries and your dream has dried along with it, because who plans on that? Or the news from the specialist at the hospital isn't so good? Who plans on that? Or all the things you thought would make you happy that you accrued in the first half of your life. And they just didn't work because the wine stopped working. What do you do with that? Well, there's that voice of God. Hello? You ready to surrender? There was so much grace and freedom for me when I just let go. I'd like to say that I did it willingly, and I'm a very virtuous person who said yes to God. No, I didn't have I was in pain, and I had to let go. But it was so gracious and so much freedom because I moved my life forward. I finally moved forward in some important ways, deeper and better and upward and into a new joyous kind of life. By allowing something to die when it's time to die, we create the conditions under which new life can emerge. Something beautiful and new, a tulip, can be born. And it's really odd. It's so counterintuitive to the way the world works that we fall in order to rise. That's Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward. We suffer to get to glory. We lose in order to gain. We surrender in order to win. God is so gracious with us in those moments. God teaches us sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, how to take our paws off our own lives and to let our lives be turned into lives of deep service to others. The only true way to live. The wisdom of the saints will tell us so, and the people that we believe to be wise will tell us that, and they show it forth in their lives, deep and meaningful lives. We find out through falling that, surprise, it isn't about us. What a shock that was to me. What do you mean it's not about me? And I think that it's in this coming apart, this falling apart, and this surrender that we learn everything that matters spiritually from this. Well, I want to invite you to get to know Episcopal Charities. And the reason I say that is because we are an organization whose mission is that, which is to serve, after the model of Jesus, knowing that true joy and true meaning come from remembering that it isn't about us. We provide grants, annual grants, to organizations around the diocese that are doing frontline work with people who are formerly incarcerated, to women and children and disadvantaged persons, to homeless persons, to providing training for folks who visit people in the hospital and give spiritual care, and you name it, to disadvantaged youth who need a hand. It's really important work, and it's the work of this diocese and of people like you with whom we want to build a relationship that isn't just about helping people. It's about learning to live into who we're called to be, beyond it being about us, remembering that it is about so much more. It's about God and about those who are themselves, their lives are falling apart and need a hand from us. And there is no greater joy than giving ourselves away for others in this way. Now that our prison chains are unfastened, we have come to know that it's not about us anymore. So I invite you to get to know us, and you may receive a newsletter and some contact information from us here today. And I'd love to be in touch with you and meet with you, and to build some relationships together so that we might live into this truth together as Christians and those who are called to follow Jesus. Amen.